When you think about heart health, there are some numbers that go with it that are important to know. When we talk about heart health, we most often are talking about what I think of as plumbing. We're talking about blood vessels that feed the heart, and we're talking about cardiovascular disease, plugging up those vessels, talking about preventing heart attacks. So if we think about the determinants of cardiovascular disease, I think the reason I think about numbers to be aware of is because they generally are things that we don't feel. So it's not good enough to say I don't feel bad to know that you're preventing cardiovascular disease. So one of those is blood pressure, probably the most important one. If we look at groups of people with high blood pressure who are untreated, their rates of cardiovascular disease and structural heart disease and electrical heart disease are actually very, very high. And most people will not feel their blood pressure until it's quite high. Every adult should have a blood pressure done at least every few years. And if you're ever told your blood pressure is high, you need to check it repetitively until you know it's under good control. Normal blood pressure is 120/70. And you can be a bit higher than that under certain circumstances and not necessarily have somebody throwing drugs at you, but we should be aiming at a blood pressure around 120/70. Another important number is cholesterol. Cholesterol is the most important fat when it comes to making plaque in our arteries. The amount of plaque and the rates of cardiovascular disease and heart attack and stroke are directly related to the LDL cholesterol. There are details that you could go into, but if you were to just look across the board at a number to know, if you can know your LDL cholesterol concentration, that would be very good. If you happen to be able to do more advanced labs, there's something called ApoB that is a way to count those particles of LDL. That would be helpful. Another way to think about it, if depending on what labs you have access to, is something called non-HDL. Basically, the HDL cholesterol is the only stuff that's helping you in there, and all the rest of the cholesterol is adding to risk. So a non-HDL cholesterol would be another kind of a number. Any of those. If you don't know any of them, then knowing any of them is better than not knowing at all. I think blood sugar is helpful, or at least having some understanding of where you're at in relation to diabetes. If you look at diabetics, the things that happen to them, what we think of as the diseases, the outcome of having diabetes, they're all vascular. The problem with diabetes generally is not the high sugar. It's what happens either as a result of the high sugar or the metabolic dysfunction that allows the sugar to get high is the same thing that accelerates the production of plaque. So what happens to diabetics untreated, right? They have eye problems. That's retinal artery occlusion. They have heart attacks and strokes. That's occlusion of the arteries that feed the heart and the brain. They have kidney disease. That's occlusion of the arteries that run through the heart. They lose limbs, not as much thankfully now as we used to see, but that's directly blockage of peripheral arteries. Body fat matters, and particularly visceral fat matters. Now that's actually hard to come by. You can't just step on a scale. So weight can be a surrogate of that. So, as weight rises, for many of us, that means body fat's rising. If you pair that up with some sense of weight versus height, so a BMI, that's better. So we all know the tall person who can be pretty heavy. So think about Schwarzenegger in his prime, right? He had a real high BMI. So it wasn't as helpful, but the person who has a high weight for their height oftentimes will be someone who's carrying too much body fat. If you pair it up with waist circumference, so running a tape measure around your belly button parallel to the floor, that can be a good number to know. The higher your waist circumference is for a given weight, the more likely it is you're carrying too much fat. So whether we think about fat or BMI or waist circumference, they're all trying to get at body fat and particularly mid-body fat, because that's really where the risk is in terms of cardiovascular disease. It's not really a number, but you should know your family history. We have very healthy appearing people who will show up and they'll tell us scary stories. So every male in my family over 50 has had a heart attack. And if you're a guy and you're 45 and you tell me that story, even if you're a runner and you have, no apparent high blood pressure or known disease, we're going to look at you pretty hard. And I'm going to recommend you have some imaging done to look at your arteries. We're going to really want to try and pin that down if we can. So know your family history, because your family history gives you a sense of the genes that you're carrying, and that's going to be at least 20, 30% of what's going on is going to be carried by your genes. Those are ones I think about.